you're all doing well. Today for class, we just have a couple things. You're going to watch this video, which you're doing already. Nice work. As you're watching, I'd like you to take some notes. You can do it in that same document that you did your Civil War notes in last time. I still have access to that through Google Classroom, so go ahead and add that in there. If you want to send it to me again, that'd be fine, but it's not necessary. And then you guys are going to do a virtual escape room about the Civil War and the Reconstruction Era. Now, just so you guys know, as you're doing your escape room, it is going to be for points. So make sure that as you're going through it, you're really taking your time, you're looking back in your notes to find the correct answers, and as always, I'm going to be there until 4 o'clock to answer any questions that you guys have. Today we are going to look at the Reconstruction Era, which was the period directly after the Civil War from 1865 to 1878. Our guiding questions for today are: how did Lincoln aid in Reconstruction even after his death? What amendments to the Constitution were made to give the former slaves rights? And how successful were the federal, state, and local governments really in rebuilding the nation? So let's backtrack a little bit to the end of the Civil War. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but that didn't exactly legally free the states yet. Fast forward a couple years to April of 1865, and we have General Lee surrendering to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Ford Theater. Which leaves us with Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, as the 17th president of the United States. Now, Lincoln chose Johnson as vice president because he was a Confederate sympathizer, which Lincoln thought would get him more votes for his re-election. That was just fine as long as Lincoln was alive, but since he's been assassinated, we now are left with a president who has no strong plan for Reconstruction and is pretty much fine with things going back to the way they were before the war. Now, fortunately for everyone, before Lincoln was assassinated, he had been able to pass the 13th Amendment, which legally freed slaves. It was passed at the beginning of 1865 and ratified, or actually put into effect, on December 6th of 1865. Lincoln's strong plan for Reconstruction also included something called the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave clothing, food, and medicine to those foremost slaves in need. Fortunately, Lincoln had also left this in place before he was assassinated. Now, unfortunately for the former slaves, there were also plenty of laws that had been passed before that still prohibited them from reintegrating into society completely. We have the Black Codes, which was something that told the blacks exactly who, when they could work, who they could work for, what types of jobs they could have, and how much they could make for those jobs. We also have the Dred Scott versus Stanford decision, which essentially set a precedent in the Supreme Court that black people were not considered citizens. Another problem they had was the lack of education. It was actually illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write, and so there were very few slaves that were able to get an education, which would allow them to get better jobs and make more money. Another huge hindrance to Reconstruction was racial prejudice, and these people grew up these white people grew up learning that black people were slaves, that they were the dirt of the earth, the dirtiest, disgustingest, not even human beings. And to try to reintegrate those types of people into society was not something that they could do overnight. Now, sharecropping was something that became very popular at this time, and basically the former plantation and very wealthy landowners would share a part of their land with the former slaves or rent out that land. The slaves would then work really hard and grow their crop, and then they would have to sell their crops, whatever harvest they produced, back to the landowners. The landowners usually charged them really low prices. Basically, it was just another form of slavery. We also have the very famous Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, which was a very violent organization of Confederate veterans, people who fought for the Confederate side of the Civil War and did not want to see black people integrated into society. Their goal was to suppress and victimize these former slaves. They took part in a lot of lynchings, which was beating black people and hanging them to death. We also have something that was called the Jim Crow laws, which was basically a way to bypass racial integration. The Jim Crow laws said that we could have separate, as long as everyone had the same, we were still equal. So maybe they would have a water fountain for white people and for black people. They would have a school for white people and for black people. But as long as they had the quote unquote same opportunities, then it was technically still equal. We also have this group of people called carpetbaggers, and they were called that because literally they carried bags made of carpet or rugs. And these were people from the north that moved to the south during the Reconstruction period who just wanted to take advantage of the fact that there is an unstable government. There was a whole race in this nation that was being oppressed. And as you can see in the cartoon, then they came down with a little whatever carpet bag they carried, and then they went back up north with all of these things. Now, all of that took place in the first part of the Reconstruction. Then in 1869, we have Ulysses S. Grant, who, if you remember, was a Union general during the Civil War. He was elected as the 18th president of the United States, and he had a slightly more firm position on Reconstruction, so he was able to get more things done. Now, one of the first things that Ulysses S. Grant did during his presidency was passing and ratifying the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So at this point, most of the slave population had been born within the United States, and so all of a sudden they all were granted citizenship. Now, we can't think that it just was the presidents and white men that were helping to advocate for black people's rights. There were plenty of former slaves who were also in the fight. People including Booker T. Washington, who was the man who wrote the book Up From Slavery. Excellent book if you ever want to read it. He was quoted for saying things like, "I shall allow no man to belittle my soul by making me hate him." Excellence is to do a common thing in an uncommon way. And if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else. Now, Booker T. Washington was most famous for his institute, the Tuskegee Institute, that he created. And his goal was to educate former slaves so that they could take their place in society. Now, we also have some other former slaves, such as W.E. Du Bois, who worked closely with Booker T. Washington, even though his viewpoints were slightly different on how to reintegrate black people into society. We also have Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist and who helped expose some of the realities of the South, and Marcus Garvey, who started the Out of Africa movement, which basically was saying allow the slaves, the Africans to go back to Africa. Now, in the midst of all of these people either fighting for or against former slaves' rights, we have another important amendment that was passed and ratified in 1870, the 15th Amendment, which allowed black men to vote. Careful, just black men. However, it did not prevent the states from keeping the former slaves from voting by means of literacy tests. Oh, you can't read? I guess that you can't vote. Or a poll tax. Oh, you want to vote? You have to pay. And then coming to the end of the Reconstruction period, we have Rutherford B. Hayes, who was elected the 19th president in 1877, who put a stop to all Reconstruction in the South because he decided to pull all Union troops out of the South, which was great for the white men because then they didn't have to be forced to allow the slaves equal rights, but it was not so great for the former slaves, and they had to continue to fight to be completely integrated and a member of society. As a review, we have Andrew Johnson, who became president in 1865 after the assassination of Lincoln. We have the Freedmen's Bureau, created by Lincoln to give food, clothes, and medicine to former slaves. We have sharecropping, we have the Ku Klux Klan, and carpetbaggers, all whose lives were to take advantage of former slaves. We also have the Jim Crow laws, who wanted separate but equal status for the slaves. And we have former Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected 18th president in 1869. We have the 13th Amendment, which legally freed slaves, the 14th Amendment, which granted them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which allowed them to vote, even though it didn't take into account people charging them poll taxes. We have a former slave, Booker T. Washington, who created the Tuskegee Institute and fought for rights of black people, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Marcus Garvey. And finally, we have our president, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was elected as the 19th president in 1877 and put a stop to Reconstruction. Now, make sure you guys have those notes written down and go ahead and head over to the escape room. Have fun with that. I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it for you guys. And have a great Semana Santa. I love you and I miss you guys.